Okay, hi everyone. I'd like to thank Layla Black for opening our program with a land acknowledgement video from the Woodland Cultural Centre. We'd also like to thank our partners, Dar Jacir and the Queer Caucus at Western University. And we'd also like to thank Grunt Gallery for providing closed caption support for this program. This is Land Trust. You're watching Land Trust, a screening and panel across Palestine and Turtle Island hosted by the Embassy Cultural House, which was originally founded by artists Jamali Hassan, Ron Benner, and jazz musician Eric Stash in 1983, and it operated as an artist collective until 1990 within the Embassy Hotel at 732 Dundas Street, London, Ontario. Embassy Cultural House was re-envisioned at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic as a virtual artist-run community space by Tarek Gordon, Ron Benner, and Jamali Hassan, and it now has over 100 contributors who have joined the community as participants, volunteers, and advisors. Embassy Cultural House is rooted in the community of London, Ontario, on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, Attawandaron, and Huron-Wendat peoples, at the forks of the Deshkan-Zikbi, an area subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum and other treaties. My name is Asif Ho. I sit on the advisory circle of ECH, and I'd like to welcome Salah Hassan to introduce some of the artists in our program.
Thank you, Adrian. It's really a great pleasure to be part of this program and to be affiliated with the Embassy Cultural House and Queer Cinema for Palestine, and to be have the opportunity to hear these artists talk about their work. So I'm really delighted and honored to have been included in the program. And I also have the privilege of introducing two really fascinating artists who are part of the program. Wes Harmon, whose work for this piece is titled Land Trust, is Carrier Witat, a nation amalgamated by the federal government under the Lake Babine Nation. They are currently living and working in the territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. They are the curator at Grunt Gallery. Their multidisciplinary art practices include reading, illustration, text, poetry, and curation. As a mixed race, trans, non-binary artist, they work to find their way through, and I'm quoting, a tasty plethora of some kind of undiagnosed attention deficit disorder, colonial bullshit, and queer melancholy. To the best of their patience, they do this with humor and a carefully mediated cynicism. So it's a great opportunity, I think, for people to see Wes's work as part of this program that's been put together by the Embassy Cultural House and included in Queer Cinema for Palestine. And it's quite generous and wonderful that they're available to participate. Qais Assali, whose work is titled Dawud Yayanathan, is an interdisciplinary art designer born in Palestine in 1987. He resided with his family in the UAE before returning to Palestine, where his family also is, in 2000. His works with photography, video, performance, and in the archives engage and subvert national and global geopolitical power dynamics. He is currently an Andrew Mellon Assistant Professor of Digital Design at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. Assali taught in visual communication at Al-Ummah University College in Jerusalem and at An-Najah National University in Nablus. He has held several important residencies in 2019, from 2019 to 2021 as core fellow at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, and in 2018-2019 as artist in residence in critical race studies at Michigan State University. Qais and I have been friends since the time he was a resident at Michigan State University, and we have many things in common and continue to look at ways of possibly working together in the future. So it's really great to be on the screen, so to speak, with Qais, and to have Qais and Wes together here. Thank you.
Great. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Justin Ducharme. Justin, who presented Positions as part of this screening. Justin is a filmmaker, writer, dancer, and curator from the small Métis community of Saint-Amboise on Treaty 1 territory. He is the writer and director of 4 short films and is currently in development on his debut feature. Justin was the recipient of TIFF's Barry Average Fellowship and is an alumni of their 2021 Filmmaker Lab. His writing has been featured in Canadian Art, Room Magazine, and Prism International Magazine. He currently lives and works on unceded Coast Salish territory. I'm also really happy to present Rana Nizal, who screened Something From There. Rana is a Palestinian-Canadian artist immersed in community organizing both on Turtle Island and in occupied Palestine. Her photography, film, and installation works look at the complexity of decolonial disruptions, combining storytelling with critical analysis to draw links between lived experience and broader systems. Rana holds an MFA in documentary media from Ryerson University and currently works with prisoner justice groups in Palestine. And also, finally, I'd like to introduce the moderator of our talk, Wanda Nanibush. Wanda is a Anishinaabe image and word warrior, curator, and community organizer from Beausoleil First Nation. Currently, Nanibush is the inaugural curator of Indigenous art and co-head of the Indigenous and Canadian Art Department at the Art Gallery of Ontario. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Wanda.
Anine, hello everyone. I'm really honored to have this conversation with all of the artists present here. We're going to dive a little deeper into some of the things happening in this eclectic but really important group of works. So I want to actually dive straight in to Rana's film, and partly because I know your mother too, and so it was like so beautiful to kind of walk inside your film with your family. And that line that she has, "If Palestine is free, would people ask for such a gift?" And then the way in which visually, you know, filling bags of soil from different areas, that's the gift she's talking about. So soil as this connection to land that one has been violently and forcibly removed from. How do you relate to this gift of soil as a younger generation?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think that in a way, the whole film is a film about the Nakba. And it's kind of this, you know, we often refer to the Nakba, the 1948 creation of Israel and the displacement of most of the Palestinian population at the time, as this thing that's ongoing. And when I set to make this film, I was like, I'm not going to make a Nakba film. Every Palestinian film is a Nakba film. Like, try so hard to escape that. But, you know, the Nakba is the reflection of my dad's life. And, you know, the ways that the Nakba is ongoing is, it's like kind of this limbo that people are trapped in, where we don't really think about our past before it. We don't really think about a future after it. And I feel like when my mom asked that question, what if Palestine were free? Would we do this? You know, can you even imagine like snapping out of that stupor and saying, what if I didn't have to articulate and fight for my relationship to land? What if it just was? It's kind of like a question that could never be answered, but it opens up all these possibilities. I really like that came out of our conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just hangs there throughout the film too in this beautiful way. And this made me think about Wes in your like giving of the grief into the land, you know, into this hole in the land. You kind of deny the audience entry into your grief because you're not talking about it, you're not sharing it. But the way we gain entry into what's going on is kind of the moment when you cut your hair. And I was wondering about what that relationship is for you between the earth and the hair cutting, and in your culture, because I don't want to assume that it's the same for all of us. So.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Yeah, well, firstly, it's not a work that I don't normally do performance work. So it was something kind of new territory for me. And like it is public in the sense that I'm sharing it, but when I was filming it, I originally had this plan of like, I wanted to go home and I wanted to have people with me that could help me like through this process of filming. And the more I thought about it, the more it felt just so personal. And I think because a lot of the conversations I've been having over this last year, especially, and just personal losses that I've experienced have also been really tied up in a communal grief. And working both as an artist and as a curator, like we as Indigenous people are often working from a place of grief and often from a place of crisis. So there, I think I feel like I'm still really trying to think through this work. Like I had such a clear idea of like what I wanted to do, how I wanted to do it. And I'm still kind of learning back from it of like, okay, what are these impulses about? But I think a lot of it was a need to personalize my grief, especially because it is hard for me to go home. And yeah, just trying to push back against a lot of my work. I do try to like work from and towards a place of joy. So a lot of the way that my work gets presented is often in a way that I think is positive on a community level, but like I'm still a person. I'm still had a really difficult year this last year of just really sudden losses and losses that kind of felt unresolved. And then kind of from that, they also forced me to think a lot about the way other people have left in my life throughout. So I feel like it's a very vague answer. And then the cultural aspect, I was like, I'm forgetting something. The cultural part, in our culture, it is, you do cut your hair out of grief, but I think it's more often spoken about in my community. A lot of people do keep their hair short, not out of grief for a loss, but out of grief for an experience. My mom recently started opening up about her experiences at day school, and she said to me recently, like, oh, you know why I cut my hair? And I was like, I don't know, you've never told me. And she said it was because that they would pull her long hair when she was in the school. And she just can't, she never wants to feel that again. Yeah, so I'll leave that answer there for now.
Yeah, it had, I mean, because you don't tell us what exactly is going on inside of you, we can kind of put ourselves, our own grief into the land too, like in a way, or however it is we're connecting to it. And I was thinking, this silence is the way everyone kind of uses voice and silence in the work. Justin, in your work positions, there's some kind of beautiful respect going on in just in the way that the camera is kind of present but not invasive, and then the way that silence functions in it as well. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about those choices and why.
For sure, thank you. I think the biggest conversation that I had going into shooting positions with my cinematographer was that I didn't want anything to feel overtly cinematic about the way that we were shooting it. I remember the note that I gave him was like, I want it to be as if the camera was already in the room, and like we're peeking into this these moments with this character, and I feel like because of that, because we approached it with such, I guess, quietness would maybe be the word that I would use. I feel like it really helped setting the tone when I was editing it. And silence, I think, was a big thing for me in terms of my lead character. I think I've had a lot of conversations about this with folks who ask me why he's so quiet, literally quiet throughout the film. he says very few things, and he chooses his words quite wisely throughout the 12 minutes that you're with him. And there was an aspect of creating a narrative that was based on my personal experience with sex work that I wanted to show on screen, that was really about, I guess, the consumption that people may not necessarily think of right away when they think of sex work. And for me, I think writing the script, that came from just people sort of word vomiting onto this boy. And like, especially in the final scene of him and the white woman, I mean, she very much just like treats it like a therapy session. And he says very few things to her throughout the entire interaction, but what he does say to her means something to him and why he's there. And I feel like that was important for me to show, because I think sex workers on screen have been portrayed in very specific ways. And there are tropes about, I think, the way that cinema as an art has used sex workers narratively. And I was trying to sort of like counteract some of those things. And I really wanted it to be as though we were following him on this exploration journey that felt incredibly insular to him, which is why I loved how silent I think he was throughout the film. But yeah.
Thank you. It brings me to Qais, which I found to be the most complex for me to kind of grapple with, because my Arabic is not very far along. So there were certain parts that aren't translated, but I was reading your body and your language and your kind of embodiment throughout it, and trying to understand it in that sense. But like Justin's talking about this whole kind of buildup of, you know, representation of sex workers, you're also dealing with a buildup of literary representations and biblical. And I was wondering how you, why did you start there, like in terms of the film?
Yeah, thank you for the question. The film started as a research project. Pure. I was not really planning to create a video, and it became for me this kind of embodiment, and the idea of embodying specific character, which goes back to previous projects. I just find so much joy in having my voice through someone else's voice. Sometimes fictional, sometimes real character, sometimes this time was a dead body, but specifically with thinking of the representation of our representation, homoeroticism, East, West, in terms of out, not out, but the most embodiment I was excited to deal with in this work, the embodiment of the educator, the teacher. I was raised by two Palestinian educators, teachers in Palestine and outside. And I grew up in all one gender schools, public schools in Palestine and in Emirates. This created a kind of very much watching the teacher for hours. I look like the good student watching, but I'm not really listening. I just love that performance. I love it. I love like seeing what is happening. In other term, I'm also fascinated if I go back to education and go back to one of the subjects, religion in school was one of the toughest for me. Just to understand the logic of religion. And this work just made me be able to think of the exact embodiment I want to go back to connect to a specific kind of character who is not exactly represent my local Palestinianness, and refer in so many different ways. So translation became not just a problem of Arabic English, but also attitude or class or issues of even between a city and another city in Palestine. I'm embodying the Khalil al-Sakakini, who is a modernist, Arabic language educator, thinker, elitist, looking from Jerusalem, looking at my city in a specific way, connecting with him, but also fighting with him in what I'm making him to say.
Yeah, thank you. We'll circle back to some of the other thematics that are coming out as well. But I wanted to come back to Rana in terms of thinking about you having returned. So it's like you mentioned Khalid, and it's like he was between America and Jerusalem, right? Like thinking this pathway. So I was like, Rana, you've returned home in a sense. How do you think about this notion of return, and how has it been for you, like just even in general?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I moved back on my own about a decade ago, and I've been back and forth. But yeah, at first when I came here, there was this big sense of return, and then the longer I spent here, the more you realize the displacement is still happening around us. That, you know, I still can't go to the village where my father's from. I still haven't seen Tabaria. I haven't seen the Sea of Galilee. You know, it's hard to imagine that my father was from a family of fishermen. I've never lived by the sea or by water. And, you know, so much more is lost than the material. And I think that's kind of the paradox of bringing back soil for people. Like I could bring my dad back an acre of soil and it wouldn't mean anything. I mean, I bring back the handful and he cherishes it so much, but it's not a replacement for land, and it's not a replacement for a home. And, you know, here we have on the one hand, Israel's colonial reach kind of growing every day, and the amount of land is shrinking in front of us, the land that we can access. It's either being annexed or it's being closed off to Palestinians for settlements, for roads connecting the settlements, for military bases and military zones. And then on the other hand, I'm living in Ramallah, the headquarters of the Palestinian Authority, which is this donor, you know, internationally funded, internationally trained authority, partially trained by the RCMP, the same forces that were created to facilitate the theft of Indigenous land in so-called Canada. And the PA has this policy of deliberate neglect of the land. They have less than 1%, you know, in the agricultural sector and 30% in the security sector. So we're heavily policed while the land is being, facilitating the kind of colonial theft of land. It's, you know, the question that my mom asked in the film, what if it was free? It still rings true. It doesn't really feel like I've returned.
Yeah, because the return requires the whole thing in a sense, and also everyone being able to return.
Exactly.
There's a sense in the Canadian context of a bunch of us were sitting around talking about the context of being a refugee within your own land, like still being a refugee. And I was thinking about this too, Wes, in your film, because it's palpable when you can't return home, or when it's a difficult process, and like the kinds of traumas that our communities have gone to also make it difficult to go home, right? And this is something that I think exists across Turtle Island, but also I've felt in Palestine as well. And I was wondering how does like a performance kind of address these kinds of larger, you know, dislocations and disconnections for you?
Yeah. So I think I already mentioned that originally I wanted to film this at home, but my community, it's fairly remote, and like it's gotten more and more difficult to return home. Even pre-pandemic, like the Greyhound line no longer runs up north, which was sort of the major connective tissue that was affordable. And then once I'm home, like I used to feel really kind of embarrassed about how sort of stereotypically impacted by like just all of the ills of colonialism that my community is. There's a lot of problems with substance abuse. There's a lot of problems with just poverty and the things that we have to do to survive there. It can build up over time, and it definitely, for me, especially having a queer identity, like I always, when I'm feeling grief and when I'm feeling upset, my impulse is I want to go home and like I want to be taken care of, and I want to have a place to land and sleep and rest. But whenever I do that, it's actually just kind of a shit show. So yeah, so I had to rethink why I wanted to do this performance at home. And I think a part of that is having the visibility as like a queer Indigenous artist. You are always in some parts expected to represent certain pieces of your culture. And I think sometimes I get really wrapped up in this, like I need to do it this way because that is the most authentic way to do it. Meanwhile, I've spent the last 10 years on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory, and I value that so much because of how it has held my grief and how it's held all of the relationships that I've built here. So I had to like rethink what that was about. And I do think of the land here in that performance as the other collaborator, and just really acknowledging that I do trust this place and it is important to me. It is my home as well. Yeah, and I think if I keep talking more, I will lose the eloquence of that answer. So I will stop here.
This is the thing we all face when we speak. It's like, oh, it went too far. Now I lost it. I saw you nodding away, Justin. And I was wondering also if, and I think that sex work in our communities is different. Like it has different reasons, different meanings, and all of that and then the larger kind of community of sex workers, and even the discourses can be quite different, whether it's seen as something progressive or not, or, you know, all those kinds of politics. But I was wondering, just from your perspective, how you see some of those differences and empowerments, disempowerments within it, and is there a dislocation for you in the work in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that was always very apparent within my my work, even before I started writing or making films about sex work, was choice. And I think I was really lucky to meet other creatives who shared the same intersections as I do with sex work and identity. And I feel like that, because I had that from a very early stage, before I even started making work about it, when I went into it solely, like it was very important to me that people know that I was coming from a place that was semi-autobiographical, because I wanted there to be conversations around sex work as a means of survival for queer Indigenous folks, especially for queer Indigenous people who are, like Wes was mentioning, like they're displaced from their homelands. They're living in metropolitan cities that usually aren't where they were born and raised. And, not a lot of, that's not the same. People don't come to that work for those same reasons all the time. And I think as my community grew, I realized that it was even more important for me to be having those conversations, because I consider myself to be somebody with a great amount of privilege in terms of a queer Indigenous person who can talk about my experience with sex work. I'm very mask presenting, and so it was important for me to be able to, I guess, talk about that, about the intersections between survivance and then choice, because I think that showing queer Native people like as well-rounded individuals who have like sex lives was also really important to me. So I all those things where I feel like were held really closely while I was writing, and even as I continue to work on projects that I think talk about all of these themes. But at the same time, I feel like I also at times was able to just throw all of that away and recognize that I was telling a very insular story that came from me and came from my specific experience of, moving from Manitoba to Vancouver for all of the reasons that I did, and coming into my experience as a hustler. I mean, once I feel like I felt good about the way I was, I guess, doing it for the community, then I was able to be like, oh, this is still my story. I'm not quite sure if I answered your question. I feel like I rambled on a little bit, but but no, and I think like it was a huge learning experience for me as well, the more I shared the work, especially within larger sex work communities, because a lot of people don't, a lot of people aren't privy to our experiences as queer Native people on this world. And I think I was really lucky early on to have people in my life who warned me about that, like when you get invited to speak somewhere, there's a chance you're going to be the only person of color on a panel full of white women, because white women who are academics, I was told, like this trope of just having the freedom to speak about your experience. So again, really important for me to sort of acknowledge my privilege that I have to be able to even share these experiences through this work. Yeah. And again, I'm going to stop before I continue talking.
Yeah, I remember going home to the res at one point, and I brought my girlfriend with me, but I told her in the car on the way there, I was like, I'm not coming out to my family. Like, that's just not going to happen. So then they're divvying up the rooms, like to go to bed. And then I was like, no, she's staying in my room with me. And then it's like, just don't tell anyone. Like, I don't say it out loud, but I was. And so she's like uncomfortable because I kept kissing her and doing things. And she's like, I thought you weren't coming out. And I was like, no, I said I wasn't going to say it. I was like, I'm still going to be myself. And because I never said it, it was like so comfortable. Everybody was comfortable, right? And both of my brothers hit on her, which was hilarious because they hadn't caught on yet, And that formed the basis of like my first film too, because I had to tell this story. But it brings me into thinking about, how homophobia and like this kind of edict against homosexuality and queerness and all this, like for us, has definitely come through colonialism, right? And I think the same, there are similar kinds of pathways in Palestine as well, and how the occupation affects the practices of sexuality in the home, and this real public versus private division. Friends of mine, it's like you'll see them in the street and it's like man. As soon as they walk in the house, like off comes stuff, and then the mannerisms change and the femme comes out, and it's kind of incredible to see. So there's always these resistances of people, you know, who live their life as they want. So I wanted to come back to thinking through one of the narratives that's coming out in your film around, I think it's like Jonathan and David is the biblical story. So thinking from there, I was wondering if we could start there and come up to the present, because you do that beautifully in the film. So
Thank you. And I love the story with the family. I, I relate a lot because you want to tell the process of like vocalizing that is different. What do I want to tell my mom than what I want to tell my niece, what I want to tell? It's education, and there is zero education, and there is so much responsibility on a queer to become like the educators, and this is really hard. I'm not ready for it. Or just like thinking of connecting that again, and with you asked me about the story of Dawud and Jonathan, which is, yeah, it was very interesting for me to think of this kind of biblical romanticism that Khalil al-Sakakini is choosing to talk, and in his lamentations toward the death of his soulmate, Dawud, who he was calling him as Dawud, my Jonathan. So creating this kind of biblical connotation, playing between, is it homoeroticism, is it romanticism, and how I can deal with these kind of aesthetics without romanticizing the queer trauma was important to me in this process of literally channeling the dead and speak from how I think of the problems of homophobia right now in Palestine, where homosexuality can be easily in 1 second connected to betraying Palestine as being homosexual. This easiness of like these become like a traitor was something, a motivation for me to, that is 2 summers ago, I'm going through personal stories that can connect to in a very capsulated way, can think of your story of, am I saying it, am I not saying it? And really think of the power of what it means for me to be in the wonderland in the West, as Middle Eastern, what is happening? What is that magic? I came to see that magic, and that's the film became for me the result of really feeling this kind of disconnection of Western whatever invention and outness to really connect to the old-fashioned queerness that is not even archived well. And I'm questioning who wrote this. I really enjoyed how even in Christianity, this question of like the story of David and Jonathan, someone saying, yes, no, it's not a truth that homosexuality existed in the Bible. Yes, it is. It's the proof by a queer, they found it. And I found that very much exactly like what is happening in my obsession to deal with rumors. I remember entering Khalil al-Sakakini Cultural Centre in Ramallah one time, and someone is telling me there is homoeroticism in the diaries of Khalil al-Sakakini, and I got so mad. Why you're telling me this? Like, why is that so important? After his death, and years after, 10 years after, to find myself really being obsessed to go back to that rumors and to investigate it, and to think of that, the violent act of outing someone. Is it really violent? It's all of these questions of that I was dealing with in this research. Yeah.
Just a little bit, eh? Just, you know.
Sorry if I speak.
And just layers and layers and layers. You just keep peeling the onion back, you know. And then all the tears come, and then you make really good food and you eat. It's kind of like art making, right? I was thinking about Wes, I was thinking about your like one thing that I found as I was watching it is because of their silence, the presence of the land actually becomes quite sound. Like, you know, I start thinking about the sound of the wind or the trees, or like the kind of space starts to enter in. And I was wondering about how you regularly connect to land, and what does that mean? Like the title is Land Trust, right? And we stole the title from you for this talk. And I was thinking, is there a connection in terms of, I know land trust can be, you know, all of our lands are held in trust, right? Like we don't actually own anything, but then there's this notion of stewardship, which also is a kind of trust relationship. But then there's this idea of trusting, you know, and the land. You know, just throwing it out there.
Yeah, so when I was kind of grappling with like, okay, I'm going to film this down south here rather than up home, it suddenly became a question of, okay, where is this piece of myself that I'm burying going to be safe? Or like, what is the safest option? Because one of the other things we do talk a lot about in our culture, because a lot of, especially the men, do cut their hair, is how to dispose of it safely. Because there's always stories of like, oh, if someone gets a hold of your hair, they're going to do bad magic on you. And like the seriousness of which this is told is so ingrained within me. I was like, okay, I really need to pick somewhere that, you know, eventually my hair is not just going to turn into like a condo parking lot or something. So
that would be some bad magic.
Yeah, right. I'm like, no one needs that in their life. So I really had to think about like what places in the city are protected, which kind of dived into like looking a little bit into the UBC endowment lens, what that means. And then there's also like, I filmed in Pacific Spirit Park, which it's a beautiful park, but it's also situated in a community that is so far beyond my class in terms of money. Like all of that land is like bought and sold, and if it's abandoned, it's still untouchable. And this park is the one public space. So it kind of came down to access, and then trying to like measure what I trusted the most. And yeah, and just, I was trying to talk through this work with my sister. And when I started to realize that I couldn't do it up home, I was like, I just don't understand why I feel this way about why I feel so guilty about thinking about doing it in Vancouver. And she's like, well, you're burying a part of yourself. Like, and the way she, like that really simple phrasing, I was like, oh, right. Like there's really difficult connotations to that. And it's tying myself to this place in a way that is ritualized and is spiritualized. But also from a place where we don't have a history of like, this is not like a cultural history thing that is done throughout my people. It's something I made up on my own because I don't have enough cultural knowledge to know other ways of dealing with this. Yeah, so it feels in certain ways like a little bit like a leap of faith, but like I tried to put as many things in the way as possible, be like, okay, I feel okay to do this. I feel okay to do this. And yeah, stopping talking there.
Yeah, I think the site is actually made me think about some other things too, like the parkification of land is something I know that Palestinians face all the time in terms of Israel turning, you know, villages that, you know, were ethnically cleansed, as you say in your film, Rana, or I think it's your father that, or maybe it's your mother who uses that language. But thinking about, you know, whenever we visit a village, it's like it's in the process of becoming a park. And then the slow process of erasing, you know, any presence, you know, that you can from the land. And, you know, Canada has a similar had a similar process. It's a process of settlement and colonization. It's one of the ways in which the renaming, the rehistoricizing, and the erasure. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that. I know that's part of your father's story.
Yeah, you just made me think of so much. Israel actually uses this really old Ottoman laws that were used to categorize land, and they would measure, they were used at the time in the Ottoman period for taxation. You know, they would say how many fruit trees there are on a piece of land versus how many non-cultivated trees, like forestry trees. Israel now uses it to justify land as forestry land and then annex it and then say this is like protected parks. And we've seen that in so many areas. And one of the ways we see it is they've planted, mainly the Jewish National Fund has planted millions of pine trees, and then they just spread. And so much of the colonial like infrastructure around us is actually this natural stuff that, you know, a lot of people will look at and think it's a tree, like it's a natural part of the landscape. And without knowing the history, a lot of people don't know the ways that even the natural landscape has been completely redesigned to fit a certain narrative. Yeah, I don't know. In the same way, like my father's town, I think I could, if I wanted to, sneak in and go there. I think I could, but I haven't yet because there are no Palestinians left in his town, and I don't know what I would go and do there. I keep thinking about that. I think my mom took us when we were very young, but I don't really remember. And she did film it, and my father had such a hard time watching the footage. Yeah, it's just hard. I mean, even for my dad, like it's so much easier for him to just follow the news every day than to look at footage of the landscape. If I send him videos from a hike, you know, that's so much harder than every day he's glued to the news till today after, you know, 70 some years in exile. So much of it is still fresh for him. And then at the same time, there's kind of an acceptance. And I think that comes out in his voice a little bit. Like he has an amount of refusal. Like he's still so focused on the struggle. So there's definitely a refusal, but then there's also sort of an acceptance of his life in exile and the fact that it's going to be incomplete. Yeah.
Yep, you have to continue to live, and somehow that requires a certain amount of acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, living becomes untenable in a sense. I was thinking about how, you know, we are talking about film today, but many of you use other formats and mediums and other ways of narrativizing things, telling stories or making work. And Justin, I love that you're a jigger, first of all, since you were like 7. But also a poet. And how do you make decisions? Like when you want to make something, does the medium call for the story, or does the story call for the medium? You know what I mean?
I think they all, for me anyways, they've all kind of enforced one another, even when I thought maybe they weren't. I remember I had such an aversion of calling myself like a poet or a writer for a while because I never really shared any of that with people. And it wasn't really, I guess, until I met Amber Dawn, who I co-edited Hustling Verse with, and who is a very dear friend and mentor and teacher. But I feel like she kind of gave me the nudge that I needed to identify as a poet or call myself a writer. And especially, I think when I got to film school, I found myself frustrated with I guess with my lack of like knowledge about certain things that I didn't learn about in high school. I went to a really small high school in a small Métis community, and like we learned what we learned. And I remember sitting in like art history classes and feeling like robbed of this knowledge. And in film school, I was writing like poetry or just prose, and allowing that to inform the work that I was having to do in school, whether it was screenwriting um, or directing or anything like that. And that was always really helpful. And then I really did not put the two link together until I met Amber Dawn, until I was like, oh wait, I've been writing poetry for like 10 years. I just don't share it. And I was weirdly using it as like a research tactic when I was writing scripts, or when I was going into making a film. You know, I'd write poems. One of my first films that I made with two of my friends, I like just gave them poetry that I had written, that was like written from the voice of specific characters. And then I was like, take whatever you want from this poetry, pull dialogue, and then we're going to film, and something will come of it. And it was like a very melodramatic, like like crazy like resi relationship drama where they were just like fighting for 5 minutes. But still, it was like, I feel like it allowed me to let some of those walls down, where I thought I was like, I thought I had to really section myself as like one or the other. And I was like, no, I can do it all. And I mean, jigging, like I've been jigging since I was like born, basically. And I was a part of a group growing up that would travel competitively and like compete in jigging contests and square dance contests. So I grew up with like aunties and uncles like teaching me about artistic discipline from a very young age, because I was like dancing competitively. And I feel like the older I get, the more I realize how much I actually learned from that as a young kid, and how much even like what I learned as a dancer growing up traditionally still enforces the way I approach my work now.
Thank you. One last question, and then we are coming towards the end. But Qais, I wanted to ask you, thinking about along similar lines, because you yourself are a professor of literature.
No, not literature.
No, not literature. Media. Is it media?
Yeah, I teach in design, graphic design. It's important to say that it's not literature. I'm not, it's not. It changed the whole perspective.
Just like, how do you? Is there? In terms of thinking about this teacher character as well, the way we embody knowledge and the way we teach as an artist versus in the classroom versus in the context of family, you know, there are different kinds of embodiments of those things. And I think that's partly what's coming out. If you could say a bit about your standing in those roles.
Yeah, thank you for a great question. And I loved how Justin also talked about how it's very fluid, kind of thinking of like the process making, how it can go. For me, it's just very challenging, just like those roles and role playing. I always been like student in the morning, teacher in the afternoon, artist, designer, rules, no rules, customer, or your own expression, or all of that really contradict sometimes, and having those in one day was hard for me. So it became something that I really, the most I care about in any starting point of a project is really looking at the medium, starting from a specific research questions, but seeing if, but really deciding the act more than the medium. What kind of act I want to do here, not literature. I want to do something. So I love those questions, and for me now, just coming to also to learn what is art making in the United States, having undergrads in art from Palestine to come here and having that kind of, it's really not just of how to become an artist, but how to think of the politics of art here and there, what it means to be an artist here and there. What is lost in translation for me? There was so much lost in translation and gained in what is my understanding for art. So what is information and phobias and around information sometimes in notions of like around didacticism, didactic work, and that became something I'm very interested in what is art education and in my master's. Yes, it can go really on and on, and I love thinking of the medium of cinema or video in terms of what kind of narrative and how to play of history of narratives and how to deconstruct it, but like create a narrative that can be fully aware of what those knows, what is the politics of this language, what is the politics of using subtitling, what is the, you know, like there is so much to see there, which is not really the art mediums or the visual art itself, but like how we are speaking, how we are narrating, how we are translating which word and which politics and which is heavy and important in all works.
Thank you. So I want to thank all of you for your brilliant work, but also the generous conversation that we've had and how much you've shared with the audience today and with myself. And I really, really appreciate it. And I think we are in the context of a festival, a kind of worldwide festival, a solidarity, action kind of moment. And I do think that, especially as an Indigenous person, this is, you know, Palestine's freedom is the issue of our time, that if we cannot find a way to get there, to actually hold Israel accountable, to hold each other accountable, especially, you know, in the context of Canada, we're very, very inculcated, responsible for what's happening. I think we have just failed as human beings. We've failed yet again. And I hope that that's not going to be the story we tell in the future. But thank you so much for being here and for making amazing work.
Thank you for great questions. And it was great to see like all our connections that I was seeing them watching all movies were just like, I'm so honored to be speaking with all of you.
Feel free to say something if you want.
Yeah, just echoing, thank you so much. And yeah, I thought you connected all of our works in such a beautiful way. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, this is brilliant. Thank you so much.
That's great.
To hear from everyone.
Nice to see your beautiful faces. All right.
Thank you,
That was
everyone.
pretty good time-wise, I think. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
That was so inspiring. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. That was really great. Wanda, you were amazing. You did a really, I don't know how you did that, but you did a great job.